It's 0.04 millimeters. I poke that through only to find that you can get your feeler gauge through at either end of the... This process is potentially easier if we remove the nut. It's a slow process, but I don't want to use anything that is thicker than that. So I use short strokes going in this direction and not really being touched in this region here. So after a few light strokes, we can inspect and see how well that did. There's one or two which are a little bit higher than the others. I don't press it down particularly hard. It's Z-shaped, so it's asymmetrical. You would feel those scratches. They would be very coarse and it would be unpleasant. Somebody is waiting for their walk. Who wants to go on a walk? Walk? What do you think, Albie? Walk? Should we go for a walk? This is the Japanese Fender Stratocaster neck that I've recently refretted. It went from some narrow vintage frets to some modern vintage frets which are slightly wider and taller. And the next step in the process is to level the frets. First thing I want to do is make sure that the neck is perfectly straight. So there's lots of ways of doing that. My preferred way is to use a notch straight edge and a feeler gauge. This is the finest gauge in the pack. It's 0.04 millimeters, and this will reveal where there are any gaps between the straight edge and the fretboard. And as you can see, if I poke that through in the middle, the neck is slightly concave. It has a little bit of forward relief even without any tension. And as we go through, we can see that we've got a bit of a gap at the 5th fret, 4th, but it won't go through at the 3rd. It goes through at the 12th, 13th, 14th, and it'll just get through at the 15th. So we need to tighten the truss rod a little bit to try to straighten the neck a bit more. So we'll just give it a very small, maybe about 1/8 of a turn, perhaps less, and see what that does. We do need to be slightly patient with this because a change in the truss rod can lead to a change in the neck relief over several minutes and sometimes even hours. So that's made a small change. I can still get the feeler gauge through at the 12th fret and 5th, but not the 4th. So we can try a little bit more. You do need to be a little careful with this approach because sometimes the fretboards never started out flat. So you can be happily tightening the truss rod trying to get rid of a concave bit in the center, only to find that you can get your feeler gauge through at either end of the fretboard, that you sort of developed a back bow. But even with a back bow, there are certain frets where you can get your feeler gauge through, so you do need to just be careful with this. So this now, I'm pushing this through. Let's come through from this side. I can just about get it through. But it's now pretty much straight. It's about as far as we can do it. And if I just do it with my eye, I can see no air, no light getting through. So that seems to be pretty good. So I will check that again in a few minutes just to be sure, in case the neck continues to move, but at the moment the neck is straight. Having done that, Next thing we want to do is to use our fret leveling beam to make sure that each fret is completely level. And the simple way to do that is to use a Sharpie or permanent marker pen and to just put a line over each fret. Like that. Now just let's see whether the neck has changed in those few minutes. I can't get this underneath. Maybe a little bit, but not much, and it's not going under at the first fret, which means that we haven't developed a back bow. So that seems good. Now we take our fret leveling beam. This process is potentially easier if we remove the nut, but it's not necessary to do that. You just have to use shorter strokes. So I use this leveling beam. It's homemade. It's very level, and I use 320 grit sandpaper for this. It's a slow process with 320 grit, but I don't want to use anything that is thicker than that or more coarse than that, because it leaves big scratches, and those scratches are harder to get out the coarser the grit that you use in this first process. So I start with 320 grit and accept the fact that it might take a little longer with this relatively fine sandpaper. So I use short strokes going in this direction up and down the fretboard, and I'm also making sure that I'm fishtailing slightly to make sure that I'm following the radius of the frets, and I'm allowing the weight of the leveling beam to do the work. I'm not pushing too hard. So after a few light strokes, we can inspect and see how well that did. And we can see that we've got a slightly low fret here and here and here in this central area. The 10th fret is a little bit high, and we're not really touching the frets too much down at this end. So there's nothing untoward at the moment. We just have a couple of highish frets, 10th and the 5th, but they don't seem to be too high. All right, so if we inspect again, we're now starting to touch the 2nd fret. We're still not getting very much around here and very little up this end. So before going any further, what I will just do is I will just check that the neck is still straight. So the reason that the frets are not really being touched in this region here is not because the neck is concave or has too much forward relief, because the neck is still straight. So we continue. I like to put some fall away on the upper frets, and one way of doing this is to put some tape over the frets, possibly around about the 12th fret. Put a few strips of tape on here to produce a slight angle, and that's a sort of a way of getting a fairly consistent amount of fall away. I tend to, having done this for a while now, I tend to just do this by hand. So I push quite hard down this end and just concentrate the effort on the final few frets. And when we do that, now hopefully you can see that we've covered most of these frets. We're starting to remove the marker. We have a few areas where the marker is still apparent just at the edges of the frets, so I need to concentrate a little bit more just at the edges to make sure that everything is flat. And we still have a couple of areas which are untouched, and that's because which fret is that? 19th fret is a little high on this side. So we'll just work on that. All right, and we've nearly resolved this issue now, so we're nearly done, certainly in that area at least. Okay, that's nearly done. So I think the issue that we have at the moment is it's the 10th fret, which is a little bit high, and that's stopping us getting a complete level frets at the minute. So we'll just work on that area now. All right, and now we can see that we've just about started to get rid of the black marker on this fret and this fret. We're very close around here, so we're nearly there. And just remember, this is very fine, relatively fine sandpaper. So although we've been doing this for a few minutes, I'm not taking off a huge amount of material, certainly off most of the frets. There's one or two which are a little bit higher than the others. Something that is a useful index of where the frets were high is to look at the amount of fret dust around each fret, and you can see that we've got a high density here and here, very little on the first fret, very little in this area, very little in this area, and more here. So this is telling us which frets were high. It's quite a useful way to see where you've been and where the problems were. So I think we've just about kissed the top of every fret now. There's still a few which are a little untouched around this area, but everything else has been lightly kissed. So we don't want to overdo it. We only need to just kiss the top of every fret. We don't need to grind them right down. Okay, I think that's it. And then I will just repeat the fall away at this end. And then one last go over the entire fretboard to blend that back in. So with a fretboard such as this, which is a 7 1/4 radius, it is important to make sure that you put some fall away on, because that will help get rid of choking, which is a notorious problem for guitars with a very tight radius fretboard. And maybe you can see where all the fret dust is now, and that tells us which areas of the fretboard required more sanding. In order to protect the lacquered fretboard, we're going to tape up the neck. So just use standard masking tape. I don't press it down particularly hard, because with lacquered fretboards, what you don't want to do is to pull up any lacquer afterwards. So you need to do this with some caution. But you do need to do it because the next few steps can damage the lacquer if you don't take precautions. So all we need to do is to just lay down pieces of masking tape in between the frets. And this will just help protect the fretboard from the next steps. So I don't need to show all of this. So we'll come back to the video when I've finished this process. Alright, so the fretboard is now taped up. This will just add a little bit of protection to the fretboard so we don't damage it in the next process. So the next thing to do is to put some lines back on the frets. And the purpose of the lines this time is so that we can consistently reconstitute the crowns of the frets. And we do that using a crowning file, such as this. This is my current favourite. It has a diamond cutting surface. It's Z-shaped, so it's asymmetrical, and I just find that this is really good for working on most types of fret, including quite low ones. And you can just run it across the fret, and this is taking material more off the right hand side of the fret, so then you turn it up the other way and it will take material off the left hand side of the fret. And what you're looking for is a nice thin line across the top of the fret, and that line should be thin and parallel all the way across. So you don't want to take off too much at the edges. The black line down the middle should be very thin and perfectly parallel as it goes across. And this is very easy for those frets where you didn't take much material off. But you need to spend a little bit more time on frets which were proud and therefore had to have more material taken off. Well, there's the first 5 done. I'll do the rest, and you can pick up the video when I've done a few more. Hopefully you can now see that we've got very thin black lines across the tops of the frets as we've restored the crowns, and the lines really don't need to be thick at all, and in some cases they've almost gone. I like to make them as fine as I possibly can and as even as I possibly can across the frets. We've levelled the frets and we've restored the crowns, Now what we need to do is we need to get rid of all of the scratches that we've put in the metal and polish the frets so they're nice and smooth and shiny. So to do this, I use sandpaper. Now, in the leveling process, we went in this direction using 320 grit sandpaper. So we will have some quite deep scratches going in this direction. And if you're bending notes across the frets, you would feel those scratches. They would be very coarse and it would be unpleasant to play. So we really need to get rid of those 320 grit scratches going in this direction. So what I do is I first of all start out with some slightly finer sandpaper. So I use next 400 grit. And I'm very careful with this because 400 grit sandpaper is coarse enough to lower the fret if you overuse it. But if you're relatively careful, then it is the quickest way of getting rid of 320 grit scratches. So the technique that I use is I first of all just run it up and down the fretboard this way. So this is now going in between the frets and helping round over the frets, helping to reconstitute the crowns. And then very gently I go in this direction. And I'm barely pressing at all. I'm just trying to get rid of the deeper scratches using 400 grit sandpaper. And I want to do this in the direction of bending, so that any scratches that I'm putting in now are going in this direction, and you won't feel those when you're bending notes. So I should emphasise I'm really not putting very much pressure on here at all, because I don't want to change the shape of the crowns and I don't want to lower the frets. So that's all we do with 400 grit. Then we move up to 600 grit. Now with 600 grit, you'd have to press quite hard and for a long time in order to lower the frets significantly, so we can be a little bit more robust with this. But the technique is the same. First of all, we go in this direction. And then I use a fret rubber. Now, I don't really like fret rubbers, but if they've been used quite a long time, you generate a groove in the top. And I find these quite useful because I can put the sandpaper over the fret rubber, and then I use the grit of sandpaper that I want rather than the grit of fret rubber. So now we're going along the fret and we're getting rid of the scratches that we've introduced going in the opposite direction. So now we can press quite hard because we're not going to be changing the height of the fret in any significant amount. So what we're doing now is we're just getting rid of scratches. We're not altering the height of the fret. So every 2 or 3 frets, I'll just move to a new piece of sandpaper, a new area of sandpaper. And you can feel and sort of see a change in the reflectivity of the fret. You can see how it's gradually polishing the frets smoother and smoother. You can hear all the junk on my table rattling around with the effort. So another piece of 600. Okay, that's 600 done. Now we move on to 1200 grit. So exactly the same as before, and now with the 1200 grit we're getting rid of the scratches that we made with the 600 grit. It's important to remember that with sandpaper it's much quicker to use different grades of sandpaper than it is to try to just go for, let's say, 1200 grit after 400 grit. It will take forever to try to get rid of those scratches. But if you go 400, 600, 1200, it actually takes much less time than trying to skip grades. Right, that's done. So we've done 400 grit, 600 grit and 1200 grit. Hello Albie, come to say hello? You come to say hello? Is it time for a walk? Is it time for a walk? The next step in the process is to use either a type of micro mesh, such as this, or some wire wool. Now I actually prefer wire wool, however you do need to be very careful using wire wool because the wool disintegrates as you use it and it gets everywhere. So if I want to use wire wool, then I'll make sure that I do it on a neck where I can take it away from the guitar, away from the pickups, and then certainly make sure that the pickups on the guitar, if you do use wire wool on it, are taped up to make sure that you don't get wire wool on the pickups. So this micro mesh is an alternative to that. It's very good. I just prefer not to use it, but I will use it in certain circumstances, particularly when I absolutely don't want to get wire wool on the guitar. So I can just show you how it is. What we're doing now is we're just getting a nice high polish on the frets, and I can either stop here or I can then use a polishing wheel and polishing compound to go one stage further. Some people go even further. They'll use maybe 1500, 2000, 3000 grit sandpaper. I don't think it's really necessary. I stop at 1200 and then move on to wire wool or an equivalent micro mesh. It's a law of diminishing returns using finer grades of sandpaper. There's no doubt that you will get a better result, but it'll take you significantly longer. All right, I'll finish this off and we'll come back when that's done. Hope you can see that these frets are now nicely polished. We've gone from leveling them with 320 grit and then removing the scratches with 400, 600 and 1200 grit sandpaper, and then finally using quadruple zero wire wool or an equivalent micro mesh which is probably going from this one, I think is probably 1200. The next one up, I think, is 2400. So what we need to do now is to very carefully remove the masking tape, just being careful that we don't remove any of the lacquer. And then we can go on to the next part of the process, which is putting some strings on the guitar and finding out, having leveled the frets, whether or not we're going to need to make a new nut. I think in this case we probably will have to, but it's worth just setting the guitar up first to find out before going to the trouble of doing that. Somebody is waiting for their walk. Who wants to go on a walk? Walk? What do you think, Albie? Walk? Should we go for a walk?